Carl Dean, Dolly Parton's 82-year-old husband, died, but it wasn't just his death that made people talk. What shocked people even more were the tributes she received from celebrities she wouldn't have expected, as well as the very personal tribute she gave, which was so raw and emotional that even her closest friends couldn't speak. Stay with me, because what I'm about to tell you will change the way you see Dolly Parton and her marriage forever. Carl Dean had one of the most mysterious marriages in Hollywood history. While Dolly was living the high life, Carl Dean preferred the quiet life, far away from cameras and red carpets. Fans only got a glimpse of him through Dolly's stories, which made him sound like her rock, her anchor, and her greatest love. Now, at the age of 82, Carl Dean has died, leaving behind not only his wife, but also a legacy of secrets, devotion, and a love story that defied the odds. Watch this video to learn more. We will show you the private goodbye Dolly gave to her husband, a tribute that shocked even her closest friends and family. Tributes from stars you wouldn't have expected, showing a hidden side of Carl Dean's life that the public never saw. Stay tuned, because this story isn't just about loss, it's also about love, legacy, and a side of Dolly Parton you've never seen before. For most of Dolly Parton's career, Carl Dean was like a shadow. Even though they were married for more than 50 years, Carl avoided the spotlight to the point where it became legendary. The paparazzi couldn't catch him, interviewers couldn't get him to talk, and fans could only guess about the man who had won the heart of one of the most famous entertainers in the world. But on February 29, 2025, Carl Dean's quiet life came to an end peacefully at home in Nashville. According to close family members, no hospital scenes or media circuses, just the stillness of a man who had lived his life on his own terms. Even in death, Carl stayed private. Dolly didn't say anything to the public in the hours after he died. Friends of the couple said that Dolly, who was always known for her humor and warmth, pulled herself away. One insider, a family friend of over 40 years, said that their home felt almost holy, like stepping into a church. People had been in love for decades and were now learning to live without him. But here's the shocking part. Carl's funeral wasn't planned by a publicist or a manager. Dolly planned it herself, down to the last flower and song. It wasn't for show. It was a private gift from a wife to her husband. There were no cameras or press releases, just a small gathering of family, lifelong friends, and a few other people. Carl Dean wanted it to be private, personal, and out of the public eye. But what no one saw coming was the flood of celebrity tributes that showed how far Carl's quiet influence had reached. In a world where celebrity funerals are often turned into media spectacles, Dolly Parton chose a different path that perfectly reflected both her own heart and the fiercely private love story she shared with Carl Dean. This is what makes this tribute so unforgettable. Not only was it beautiful, but it also showed a side of Dolly that the public had rarely seen: vulnerable, unguarded, and devoid of the rhinestones and rehearsed charm. According to those close to the family, the day after Carl's death, Dolly spent planning his tribute, not as a global superstar, but as a grieving wife saying goodbye to the man who had been her silent partner through all of life's highs and lows. The tribute didn't happen in a grand hall or venue packed with famous people, but in the small White House. There was a chapel hidden away on their Nashville property, a place Carl often went to pray and think. The chapel was decorated with simple things like wild flowers that Carl would pick for Dolly from their property, framed photos of them throughout their 58-year marriage, and some photos that had never been seen before, taken from albums Carl kept in the drawer of his bedside table. There were no stage photo ops or glossy media handouts. This was a heartbreakingly honest and personal celebration. Dolly had built her public persona on humor, grace, and a sense of invincibility for decades. But in that moment, all of that fell away as she spoke directly to Carl, not the crowd or the cameras. With her voice shaking and her hands holding a handwritten letter, she thanked him for loving the woman behind the wigs and sequins and for knowing the real Dolly, the one who sang to him in the kitchen when no one was looking, the one who curled her hair and sat down next to him on the porch swing after a long tour. "You knew me before the world did," she said, her voice breaking with emotion, "and you loved me just the same." DOI then read parts of love letters Carl had written her over the years. Not even her closest friends knew about these letters. Some were short notes written on the backs of receipts or torn pages from notebooks, while others were longer, more heartfelt letters Carl left for her to find when she got home from a trip. Through those words, even Dolly's biggest fans got a glimpse of Carl Dean's sensitive, poetic side. But here's the part that really shocked everyone. At the end of her tribute, Dolly sang not one of her biggest hits, but a song she had written just for Carl decades before. It was never recorded and never shared with anyone outside of their marriage. With just her acoustic guitar and a shaking voice, she sang the words that captured a lifetime of love, heartbreak, and devotion. The chapel fell silent. By the time she got to the last verse, tears were running down her face and almost everyone else's. This wasn't the polished performer people were used to seeing. This was Dolly Parton, the woman, the widow, the wife, laying her heart bare in the only way she knew how. Even people who had known the couple for decades said they had never fully understood how close they were until that moment. Carl may have stayed out of the public eye, but in Dolly's heart, he was always the leading man. Even though the funeral was small and private, her tribute had an effect that went far beyond the chapel walls. This is because some of the biggest names in entertainment started to share their own stories about Carl Dean. Stories that would surprise even Dolly herself. For years, Carl Dean was the ghost in Dolly Parton's glittering world. Fans knew his name, but they almost never saw his face, and most people thought Carl didn't really exist. Despite having a connection to the entertainment industry, Carl chose to stay out of the spotlight while Dolly took center stage. But after he died, something amazing happened. Tributes from some of the biggest names in music, TV, and movies started to pour in, and what they said shocked even die-hard Dolly fans. First, the family of country music legend Loretta Lynn said that Carl had driven her and Dolly to their very first joint performance back in the day. In the 1960s, before either of them had bodyguards, personal assistants, or fancy tour buses, Carl was more than Dolly's husband. He was her quiet protector and the man who made sure both women got home safely when the honky-tonks got rowdy. Next came tributes from modern artists who said Carl had been a kind of unofficial mentor, giving them advice, not on music, but on how to survive fame without losing yourself. For example, Kenny Chazin, who had become close to Dolly over the years, said Carl had told him, "If you want to keep your soul, don't lose your soul. Remember that what happens when the cameras are off matters more than what happens when they're on." Those were words that Kenny said had stuck with him throughout his whole career. But here's where the story takes an unexpected turn. It wasn't just country stars who spoke out. Hollywood stars like Jane Fonda and Lily Tomlin also told personal stories about Carl's quiet wisdom. Jane Fonda talked about a dinner party at Dolly's house in Tennessee while the cast of 9 to 5 was filming, and while the women sipped wine and Carl quietly questioned steaks on the back porch, and eventually sat down with Jane and gave her a simple but powerful piece of advice about life, marriage, and staying grounded in an industry that thrives on illusion. He told me that Jane remembered, "Don't believe the hype. Good or bad, it's all noise. The real stuff is what you wake up with every morning." I'll never forget that even music legends from outside the country paid tribute to Carl. Paul McCartney told me that Carl once went to a private industry dinner with Dolly in the early 1980s, where they talked about everything from farming to fame. Paul said Carl was one of the most genuine men he had ever met, who wasn't interested in fame at all. Most of the attention came from McIntyre, who told a story that had been kept secret for decades. In the early 1990s, after the tragic plane crash that killed Reba's band members, Reba was devastated. Few people knew that Carl Dean, a man she had only met briefly, had called her quietly and offered to sit down and talk. Carl told her that sometimes you don't need answers, you just need someone to sit next to you and say nothing. That was Carl, the man no one saw but everyone felt. As the stories came in, it became clearer that Carl Dean wasn't just Dolly Parton's missing husband, but also a man whose quiet wisdom and gentle heart had quietly changed the lives of some of the most powerful people in entertainment. But here's the shocking truth. Along with these tributes came whispers of secrets Carl had taken to the grave. Stories about times Carl had to step in to protect Dolly from the darker side of fame. Times he walked away from fame to keep his own peace. And even hints at problems the couple had that they didn't tell anyone about. As the tributes went on, it became clear that Carl Dean wasn't just a mystery. He was a legend in his own right, a man whose influence went far beyond the walls of their Nashville home. Just when everyone thought they knew the whole story, one last tribute came out that would change the way fans would always think of Carl Dean. Just when everyone thought they knew everything there was to know about Carl Dean, one last tribute came out from a source no one expected. It wasn't from a country legend, a Hollywood star, or even a member of Dolly's inner circle. It came from a man who had been hidden for decades and whose connection to Carl Dean had been purposely kept from the public. The tribute came from Walter Harris, a retired Nashville music executive who had quietly left the business in the late 1980s under mysterious circumstances. His name rang a faint bell for people who knew a lot about country music history, but to the average fan, he was just a ghost. As Walter's heartfelt tribute to Carl Dean spread, it became clear that his story would change how the world understood Dolly and Carl's marriage and the sacrifices Carl made to protect it. Walter himself told a local Tennessee newspaper that Carl Dean saved his life and freedom. In a rare interview, Walter talked about how Carl had saved him from a dangerous situation in the 1970s involving the darker side of the music business. At the time, Walter was working as a talent scout and had become involved with a powerful person connected to organized crime who saw the booming country music scene as a goldmine for laundering money. Carl Dean, officially known as a simple man running his asphalt business, Carl had quietly built a reputation in some circles, not as a tough guy or an enforcer, but as someone who knew how to calm down tense situations with calm words and an unwavering sense of right and wrong. According to Walter, Carl had personally stepped in when Walter had signed contracts with dangerous people without realizing it. Carl didn't do it for fame or money. Walter was a friend of Dolly's from her early years, and Carl saw protecting Dolly's friends as an extension of protecting Dolly herself. But that wasn't all. Walter's tribute showed that Carl's quiet protection of Dolly went far beyond the occasional intervention. In the 1970s and 1980s, when country music was at its peak, Carl personally made sure that certain predatory figures in the music industry stayed away from his wife. Powerful men, like producers, agents, and executives, often preyed on young female artists because they saw their lack of experience and drive as a chance to take advantage of them. Carl Dean, who disliked fame and attention, would show up when it mattered most without making a fuss. He would show up at industry parties not as Dolly Parton's husband, but as a man who made it clear that Dolly was not to be touched, manipulated, or forced. His presence alone was often enough to stop potential predators in their tracks. Walter's tribute showed that Carl paid a personal price for being Dolly's silent guardian. There were powerful men in the industry who saw Carl's protective nature as a threat, and they worked behind the scenes to keep Dolly from certain deals and opportunities. According to HB's president, some of Dolly's best deals, including possible Hollywood crossover projects, were quietly sabotaged by men who wanted her to follow their rules instead of hers. Carl knew this, but according to Carl, never once felt bad about the sacrifices he made for Walter. He knew that being married to a star meant being the shadow behind the light. But Carl wasn't just a shadow, he was the steel frame that held the whole house together. Walter's tribute ended with a shocking revelation. Carl Dean had kept a private journal for decades that detailed every deal he made to protect Dolly from every threat he quietly neutralized, and every time his presence alone had changed. The Walter said this journal wasn't a way to get back at Carl or blackmail him. It was a love letter and a record of everything he did to protect the woman he loved. And here's the sad part, Walter said Dolly never knew the full extent of Carl's sacrifices. She knew he was a detective, but she didn't know about the late-night calls, quiet fights, or personal deals he turned down just to keep her safe. This journal Walter showed was Carl knew that a trusted family friend would not reveal the contents of the journal until after he died, when the truth would no longer hurt Dolly, but only honor her. The fact that this journal existed caused a storm of. There was a lot of talk about the journal and what it said about Carl and Dolly's relationship. They weren't just married, they were involved in a lifelong act of love, sacrifice, and protection. But here's what's even more interesting. The journal wasn't written by Carl and Dolly. As the days after Carl Dean's funeral went by, More details about his private life came to light, painting a picture of a man who was much more complicated and heroic than anyone had ever thought. As the days turned into weeks, the world began to see the full picture of the man Dolly Parton had loved for almost 6 decades. For so long, Carl had been the ghost in Dolly's glittering shadow, a quiet presence that many thought just didn't want anything to do with fame. No one could have imagined that the journal Carl left behind would become more than just a collection of stories. It became a record of the unseen battles he fought, the deals he turned down, and the predators he quietly pushed out of Dolly's way. Every page was a reminder that Carl Dean was more than just a loving husband. He was her silent guardian and protector, the man who made sure she could shine without fear. But Carl's legacy wasn't just in the past, it was still going on today. Carl's values live on in Dolly. In interviews after Carl's death, Dolly was honest about what her husband had taught her about loyalty, privacy, and how important it is to stay grounded, no matter how bright the spotlight gets. Even as tributes came in from other celebrities, country legends, and fans from around the world, Dolly's most moving words were reserved for the man who never asked for applause, but always deserved one. She talked about the quiet moments and the nights on the porch where no words were needed, the laughter that filled their humble home, and the unwavering support of a man who never left her to face the storms of fame alone. While everyone loved Dolly for her music and charm, Carl loved her just for being Dolly, not as a superstar or an icon, but as a woman whose smile could light up a room before she was famous. Just when fans thought they knew everything, close family friends revealed that Carl had planned a special tribute ahead of time. Carl knew it would be hard for Dolly to deal with his death, so before he passed away, he secretly recorded a final love letter to be played at his own funeral. In it, Carl's voice, which was soft but firm, told Dolly, "You were always my shining star, but I never needed the world to know that because you always knew if I could do it all over again, I'd choose the same quiet life beside you, no cameras, no crowds, just you and me the way it was always meant to be. I'll be waiting on the simple message, Porch darling, take your time," made everyone in the room cry, not just because of the love story they told, but also because it reminded everyone that real love doesn't have to be shown off for everyone to see. Carl and Dolly's story wasn't about fame or fortune. It was about a love so strong that it didn't need an audience. As Dolly stood next to Carl's casket and said her last words, "Please like and subscribe for more exclusive stories, tributes, and behind-the-scenes looks. We want to give you a look into the lives of the celebrities you love." What's your best memory of Dolly and Carl's famous love story? Let us know in the comments below. Remember that behind every icon is a story that most people don't know about, and we're here to tell them.